What can we know about the people who wrote the Bible?
Does it matter who they were and when they lived?
How have ideas of authorship changed over time?
Do we need the biblical authors if we want to interpret the Bible correctly?
Welcome to Horizons of Scripture, a biblical studies podcast with me, Elizabeth Corsar.
And me, Charlie Hadjiev.
Well, welcome back, Charlie. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
We've got another brand new topic to discuss today.
Yes, authorship.
Yeah, who wrote the Bible? Does it matter who wrote the books of the Bible?
Yeah, does it matter? And if it does, why and how? So let's begin with that. I mean, when you do exegesis, when you interpret a biblical passage, do you think about the author? What do you actually do?
So yeah, when it comes to exegesis, we are of course interested in the author, because exegesis is a close reading of the text to understand the meaning of the text, to understand what the text is saying. So in many ways, by doing that, what we're doing is seeking to understand what the author has said and is trying to communicate. So we are in these instances interested in the, as far as we can sort of delve back into this, the historical background of the author, to get a sense of, okay, what perspective are they coming from in this writing, to get a better understanding of the content of their writing.
And I mean, if that is correct, then the author is of ultimate significance.
Yes.
So we've sorted the topic. No need to talk further then.
Well, exactly. I mean, exegesis goes further than that. Those who are coming at it with a faith perspective will be not only interested in what the author is trying to communicate, but who the author is themselves. So we have texts that that the author doesn't actually attribute themselves within it. So we've got Moses, a traditional idea of Moses being the author of the Pentateuch, or the Apostle Matthew or John being the authors of those two Gospels.
Yes, so one is the question of interpretation and whether you look for the intention of the author. The other one is maybe the question of authority and the fact that the status of the text is linked to particular historical individuals. Yeah. So maybe we can structure our conversation around those two themes. And let's start with the second question, the question about who these people were. You mentioned the Pentateuch, and early Christian and Jewish tradition ascribed the Pentateuch to Moses, and even today for many people it is a fairly important question, and they would say Moses wrote the Pentateuch, but unfortunately for the last couple of 100 years this idea has been severely undermined by scholarships, and people have come up with some very good reasons why the Pentateuch can't really be written by Moses. Some of these have to do with the shape of the text. It is a text which doesn't look and feel like it's written by one person.
Yes.
Even at the end of it, it mentions the death of Moses.
Exactly. Did he write about his own death?
Yeah, maybe from the grave, a hand scribbling.
Yeah, it was a prophecy, of course, though.
Yeah, you could say it was a prophecy. You could say there was just this one bit that somebody added later on. But even it doesn't talk of Moses in the first person singular.
No.
Like some other biblical texts, Nehemiah or Amos, you have I.
Yes, of course.
Moses is always in the third person, says how humble Moses was, refers to events and conditions that took place much later than the life of Moses. So obviously, for example, the book of Genesis presupposes a situation when the Canaanites were no longer living in the land, which is centuries after Moses. You have reflections of the situation of the exile and so on. So people have kind of generally come to agree that at least some of those traditional positions that ascribe the authorship to a certain person probably historically not entirely correct. And I'm sure you have examples like that in the New Testament as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've got the Pauline epistles. We've got some of the Pauline epistles are our earliest writings in the New Testament, and we have texts like Romans, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, which we describe as being authentically Pauline. There's no dispute that these were written by Paul. However, we've got letters such as the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And whilst these say in the greetings to the letters, I, Paul, am writing this to you, it's more disputed in scholarship about who the author of these texts actually is. And this idea of writing the text in someone else's name in these cases wasn't meant to be deceptive, but rather was done as a way of honouring Paul or continuing his legacy. He was this great man, this great figure, and it was, as I say, that they were wanting to honour who he was and continue that great legacy that he held. So, and then we also have the other major part of the New Testament, the Gospels. We have these 4 Gospels, Gospels according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. But the original authors of these Gospels, Mark, assuming Mark in priority, writing first, he didn't write at the beginning of his kata Markon.
My name is Mark.
Exactly. I mean, what
mention it when you quote me.
We see sort of the middle of the 2nd century, these titles appearing on gospel manuscripts, and it's likely that these were added when 1, 2, 3 Gospels were collected, even the whole 4 collected together. It was at that point that the titles were put on them and not by the original authors themselves.
Yes, which is an interesting point because it points to, I guess, to differences in culture. And when we talk about authorship and how our understanding of the authority of the text is linked to authorship, we unwittingly approach it from a very modern perspective.
Absolutely.
We are both academics, and we know that when we teach students study skills, one of the first things we try and tell them is, what is the ultimate academic sin? It's not murder, it's...
plagiarism.
It's plagiarism, exactly. So stealing somebody else's words to get academic credit, or in the wider publishing world, it is stealing somebody's words to get either reputation or financial benefits.
Yes,
And so for us, it is very important to link a particular text with a particular person because there are economic, there are ethical considerations around it. And we sort of imagine almost Moses in a similar manner, that there's going through the wilderness, and maybe Miriam is leading the women in a dance of a victory song, and Aaron is playing the lyre, and Moses is cuddled in front of the fire with a papyrus and scribbling away the book of Exodus.
Yeah. And this idea that he then created his own literary canon, like we have C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, but that's not how it worked in antiquity and before. So
and it's interesting that as you pointed out, the Gospels, the authors, whoever the people who compiled and collected and produced those texts, did not deem it important to attach originally their names to those texts. So you're thinking of a different mindset in production of texts. Plus, I mean, you mentioned also Paul and people kind of writing in trying to continue his legacy. You have exactly the same in the Old Testament. The book of Isaiah is the most clear example where you have... I think it is hard to dispute the fact that there was a prophet Isaiah living in the 8th century who left prophetic material that's in the first part of the book.
Yes,
but then when you read the book, you see it's not so much that the book predicts events. It is the later chapters presuppose historical events that have already happened, that were much later. So it's obvious that people didn't feel it was problematic to continue the legacy of a great figure from the past and write in their name. They weren't thinking of this as plagiarism or frauds. They were kind of continuing the tradition.
Yes, yeah. And this is interesting. It's something I've argued recently in an essay. I've looked at John's Gospel and identified the author as the beloved disciple, and then argued that the Johannine epistles are written in the name of the beloved disciple in order to continue the legacy of that figure. And because I think this is a phenomenon in ancient times of this is what authors would do. There was a real emphasis on continuing the legacy of great figures and writers and thinkers of the time.
So you are almost like creating a character in a way by ascribing more and more literature.
Yeah.
I guess this also has to do with the different ways in which texts are produced. I mean, when you write an article, I assume you sit behind your computer and you work on your keyboard and you cut and paste stuff that you don't like.
Yes.
But texts were produced very differently in antiquity, weren't they?
Yeah. I mean, typically you would... The author would be dictating it to a scribe, and the scribe would be writing it. There would be mistakes. They would stop. It would get lost.
And if you come across a document from the past which is very valuable or interesting, it wouldn't be necessarily a problem incorporating that into your own work, which is how sources end up being part of later.
Exactly. And they had no notion of referencing in those days. They didn't have to put it in inverted commas and have a footnote at the bottom saying where they got it from. They would just slot it into their texts.
Yes, because whoever wrote that text was probably dead. They wouldn't receive royalties.
No, exactly.
In fact, you wouldn't sell the book because you would just have one or two copies of it. It will take a long time to copy the manuscript by hand. So it is a completely different mindset when it comes to the production of texts, and you would incorporate wholesale passages and sources.
Absolutely.
And you have that very clearly in the Bible. So Chronicles and Kings, for example,
of course,
it's very clear that Chronicle uses Kings, and you can put them side by side, and you can identify the passages that verbatim Chronicles takes over from Kings, and you have the same in the Gospels.
Exactly the same with Matthew and Luke, of course, using Mark, and I would argue John as well. So yeah.
So understanding who the author historically was is probably, contrary to what many people today think, is not that important in terms of our evaluation of the value of the biblical text.
Yes. How does it speak to us today? Of what benefit is it to us today? Yeah.
So you can approach the text of the Bible as divinely inspired without necessarily saying, well, Moses wrote it or Isaiah
Absolutely,
wrote all of it.
Yeah, there's that difference between the inerrancy of Scripture and divinely inspired.
Yes. But that doesn't... so moving on to the second issue, that doesn't necessarily then eradicate the author completely, because even if we can't know who wrote the Pentateuch, or even if Matthew the Apostle was not necessarily the person responsible for the Gospel, there still would have been an author, or maybe even a group of authors.
Yes.
A school, a tradition that was responsible for the production of the text. And going back to your original definition of exegesis, you want to find out what these people were thinking, right?
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, how you come across a text and you want to identify what the author was trying to say. Is that even possible? I mean, how can you even get into the mind of another human being?
No, but you can glean a lot from the content of the text, how the text is written. So I think this was really the rise of literary criticism, sort of moving away from historical criticism up into literary, that idea of how has the author crafted this this text? What literary techniques have they used? And from my perspective, I think that gives us a real insight into what the author is trying to communicate, what they're interested in, and which allows us to begin to understand who they were and from what perspective they were coming from.
Yeah, so even though you can't really get into the mind or the psyche
I
of
will
the
give
author.
you that, yes.
You can still maybe argue that there is an intentionality that is embodied in the text itself, and you can look for that.
Yeah.
Now, it is fair to say that if we continue down the path of history, when you come to the 60s and 70s, in literary theory, people were beginning to proclaim the death of the author. In other words, saying that it is not even, it's not just that it's not possible to understand the mind of another human being, but it is the wrong thing to try and do, because the text is not so much a piece of communication. It is a playground for the reader. Or a multi-volumed space where you can explore different meanings, and you can argue, and you can maybe even look for things that are important to you as a reader.
Yes, because there's this sort of imagery of, sort of the more historical criticism. You're looking through a window and seeing what's outside, but with the more reader response approaches, you're looking into a mirror and seeing what's being reflected back. So, yeah.
So as one famous saying goes, the death of the author comes at the expense of the birth of the reader. You move the attention from one to the other, and this has brought a number of new approaches in biblical studies. I don't know how excited you are about those.
I mean, you're the hermeneutics guy, but I dabble in it a little bit.
You can live with them.
Yeah.
So, for example, post-colonial criticism, people approach the text and they don't really care what Matthew or Moses or whoever wrote the text was saying. What they do care is about their personal situation, issues like justice and fairness, and they would use the text in a much looser way to kind of think theologically about issues of colonialism and empire, which is very important today. Feminist criticism. How gender plays into issues of power and so on. So not necessarily concerns that were important to
the original author, but rather to us today. How is this book still relatable, useful in the contemporary world? Yeah.
So it is an interesting question, which one is the right approach, and is there even one approach that should be adopted, or are we free? Is it incumbent upon us to adopt a number of different ways of reading the text? I told you before a story about a biblical friend of mine, biblical scholar from Ireland, who told me once how he became convinced by the value of historical criticism when he was reading a work on the Gospel of John, chapter 11, where Jesus tells Lazarus, come out of the cave, and that particular person interpreted the phrase come out as a call for Lazarus to come out as a gay person.
Yes.
So it was like a LGBT kind of reading.
Yeah.
And of course, historical criticism tells you can't do that.
Yes. There's no context for it to mean that. Yeah, you read around it what's happening. Yeah.
So the text actually in this particular case is taken up in a completely different way. Yeah. And it is actually the author who anchors the meaning of the text in a particular historical situation. Because if you say, well, we don't know who wrote the Gospel of John, but what we do know is that they were probably a Jew or a Christian who lived in the end of the first, beginning of the second century, within that general cultural situation, then the Greek they spoke had certain meaning, and the word come out did not have the meaning it has today in English.
No, and it's just part of the larger context of this contrast that the author of John's Gospel creates between Jesus, giving up his life in order for Lazarus to have life, because it's the raising of Lazarus that leads to Jesus' arrest. So in that wider context, Lazarus has to come out of the cave in order to, or the tomb, or wherever he was buried, in order to show that he had been brought back to life, and to create that contrast that the author wants. So,
yes. So the author does still seem to have a value and a role to play, even if we cannot identify their name. And even if we cannot say too much about them, still it kind of it anchors the text, and it guides its meaning. So people talk today about the author construct, which is the way that you imagine the person who wrote the text. And you may not imagine a lot about them, so they still remain a dim, shadowy figure somewhere hidden behind the text.
Yes.
You don't know their name, you don't know a lot about their personal life, you don't need to in that sense.
No.
But what you can imagine is what sort of person has written this particular text and what they are trying to tell you.
Yeah. I think that's a good summation of.
So the question is then, given that this is still in biblical studies quite an important and foundational approach, whether this is all that we need to do. I have actually for you an example.
Oh, brilliant!
And it is from the book of Leviticus that not many people begin their morning devotions with.
No, it's not your go-to book, is it?
Yes, but it is an interesting text when you try and think about the goal and the value of trying to recover the intention of the author. So it's at the end of chapter 21, Leviticus 21, and from verse 16 onwards. I won't read the whole passage, but I'll just skim through it. So the Lord says to Moses, no one who has a blemish, and he's talking about the priests, so no one who has a blemish shall draw near, one who is blind or lame, or who has mutilated face or limb too long, or has a broken foot or a broken hand. So there is this long list of blemishes, and it's quite clear that they are talking here not about intellectual or spiritual or moral blemishes. You're talking about physical disability.
Absolutely, yeah.
So people who have all these different kinds of disability are not allowed to draw near to the Lord. In other words, to participate in the temple service. And what is interesting about this passage is also the rhetoric of it. It doesn't just mention it in passing. There is a lot of emphasis here. So, no descendant of Aaron, the priest who has a blemish, shall come near to offer the Lord's offering by fire. Since he has a blemish, he shall not come near to offer the food. He may eat, but he shall not come near the curtain to approach the altar because he has a blemish, so that he may not profane the sanctuary. It is kind of a very, very strongly worded passage.
It's a really challenging passage, and it needs to be interpreted responsibly.
Exactly. So when you read a passage like this, many people will say, well, as Christians, when we read it, we need to transpose it onto another plane. And these are obviously, symbolically, they do point to the fact that the Lord expects when people come in before him, especially if they want to serve him, that they need to be morally perfect, or maybe not perfect, but they need to aspire to a life which exhibits some sort of wholeness.
Yeah.
But it is very hard to make the case that this is what the ancient author was actually trying to say in this passage, is it?
Yeah, no, because as you mentioned, there's a real emphasis on the physical disability of these priests that the author is trying to get at here.
Exactly. And you can understand that within the broader culture of the time, because in that time, people who are in leadership positions were expected to be physically perfect. Mm-hmm. That's why, for example, you don't have a lot of comment on the looks of biblical characters, but you do have mention of how various people in leadership positions looked. So Saul, for example, the first king of Israel, we are told that he was very tall and imposing. David, we are told he was beautiful, and so on. So in those particular cases, the physical looks mattered because the culture did demand from people in authority to be not disabled physically. Yeah. And that kind of idea is very much at the forefront of a passage like this. So I suppose this is the reverse part of the coin when you talk about exegesis of a text. You look for the intention of the author, but is it sometimes worth discovering that intention? What do you think?
It's worth discovering it so as we don't undertake irresponsible biblical interpretation.
But in a way, you can't really stop there, can you? Even if you have figured out what the passage says in terms of its original authors, there will be at times situations where discovering that original meaning doesn't really help you very much in terms of thinking about the text theologically or from a contemporary perspective. Yeah. There are other passages that we don't need to go to at the moment, but that are much more famous, that talk about genocide and kill them all and show them no mercy and so on. And there again, discovering the original intention of the author may or may not be very helpful.
Yes.
So I suppose here the kind of the birth of the reader may be a way of dealing with that. So we discover the intention of the author as a first step, but then it is not the final step in interpreting a passage. You need to then go beyond that and engage with it from a readerly point of view. So the death of the author, in some cases, actually may be quite helpful, because it does say to us that we need to not necessarily always stop with what the author was trying to say to us.
But it's that remembering to keep the text in its original context and being careful with the way, because a text like this Leviticus can be used for harm and irresponsibly interpreted. So it's about finding that balance. So
it is. You're right. And people who are very strong on the point that you need to discover what the author is saying would be, I guess, quite uneasy about divorcing the text from its original context, because they feel somehow the author gives you some sort of criterion of certainty in interpretation.
Yeah, so, and I think that's where I'm at, and I think that's why we're now having this debate, because I'm concerned about taking it too far beyond the author and ending up with, well, we'll just do what we like with this text. You know, we've taken it into our own hands. But yeah.
Yes, exactly. But on the other hand, if you just keep it too close to the author, if you like, then I mean, is that again? Sometimes the author may actually take you in directions you don't really want to go, especially when you have a text that comes from a culture and reflects the notions of a culture that are very, very different to our own. Like, for example, here on the issue of disability. Yeah. In our culture, we have moved to a place where we would actually be very insistent on the fact that people who have disability are as human as everybody else, and we need to honor that, and therefore a passage, if you keep that too close to the author, that may be harmful.
Yeah, true. But we live in a different society, don't we? And sometimes it's just important to recognize that.
So taking the passage beyond the author may or may not be helpful, but it is definitely tricky.
Yeah.
And when you do it, we need to think carefully about the ways and methods. I guess this is probably a topic for another podcast.
Yes, this has been fascinating, and I think something we're going to continue discussing after this recording. But I've really appreciated your input and your thoughts, and it's definitely thought provoking.
Yes, it's the same here. So it's been good talking to you.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and watch out for future episodes.
If you're interested in theology, why not visit the St. Padarn's Institute website and check out our programs?